I've been using the Panasonic S1 for a few months now, and I recently got the Vlog upgrade, so let's have a little look and see whether it's really worth it. So obviously the S1 comes with quite a few different picture profile settings. Standard is the first one that comes up, which looks really nice straight out of camera. I was shooting this scene outside while it was quite sunny yesterday, so we're not in direct sunlight, but there's sort of ambient daylight in the afternoon. The natural picture profile setting is a little bit softer, so you can see it's not quite as contrasty as the standard picture profile was, so this might make it slightly easier when it comes to a grade. And flat takes that one step further. You can see it's really soft and milky here. It's kind of similar to a log image, but not quite as far as the full Vlog. Then we've got the portrait mode, which I guess is more aimed at photography, so that adds a bit more punch in. Looks quite similar to my eyes to the standard picture profile. The Cine D is intended as a sort of low contrast Cine look, whereas Cine V is a bit more high contrast look, so I guess that's probably aimed to be a bit more usable straight out of camera. Again, looking fairly similar to the standard picture profile there. All of these were shot at ISO 640 just to keep the test fair, because obviously the log defaults to that as the lowest possible option you've got. And I was correcting the exposure with a variable ND on the front of the lens. It's interesting, you can see here with the next profile, the 709L profile, where it is corrected according to the camera. You can see at the bottom of the frame here on the Atomos recording that the exposure is set correctly to 0. It is clipping the highlights of the flower, which it wasn't with the other cameras when that was correctly set. So interesting difference with this picture profile, which just looks quite washed out, doesn't look all that colourful and appealing to me. Then obviously the next option on camera is the Vlog. So here we've just got the Vlog straight out of the camera. And then if you just apply the V709 LUT from the Panasonic website, so that's with no correction at all, I've literally just dropped the LUT on. That's what that looks like, so that's not too bad. Then we've got the HLG picture profile, the hybrid log gamma, which obviously is HDR format, which looks quite appealing to me, I think, here. Really nice and colourful and sharp, and a lot of room to play in the edit with that. So now we've just got the first 5 picture profiles, so standard, natural, flat, portrait and Cine D that came up, just to sort of compare them side by side, and you can see straight out of camera some pretty stark differences between them, all correctly exposed according to the camera's internal systems, but a lot of room to play in the edit with a few of those, definitely more than others. And then we've got the second set of picture profiles that we looked at with the Vlog as well as the LUT on the Vlog. So even with the LUT, you can see it doesn't get anywhere near the kind of bright, contrasty, saturated look of the Cine V. But obviously that's without any kind of playing at all. So this is just straight out of camera. And it's interesting to see with the HLG picture profile that the colour of the flower actually is noticeably different to in all the others. And so now I've just done a very simple quick colour correct on all the images to try and get them to look quite similar. So you can see now with a bit more contrast and saturation added and getting the scopes to all align with each other, now we get a better sense of what different images we're getting from each of these cameras. So I mean, to my eye, looking at all of these pictures, the portrait colours look really nice. It doesn't look like it's clipping to me on the scopes. And I just think the rendition of the colour in the image is really nice here, but all of them are looking definitely very usable to me. And finally, now looking at all the picture profiles, keeping standard in there just so we can compare that to the log, because that's kind of probably the most interesting thing to compare, maybe between standard and the log. I think the log LUT is looking really good, and it does have a lot of room to play. Again, now you can really see that difference with the colour on the HLG picture profile. It's a very completely different colour of purple to all the other flowers. But maybe now let's just take a look at the log and the standard side by side as a direct comparison. So both the picture profiles here are looking really good, standard and the log profile. Obviously the log you can see here, if you take a look at all the controls on the side there, I've had to do quite a bit more work to get this to look similar to the standard profile. It's not as simple as just dropping the LUT on from Panasonic. So I think in a situation like this, when you're shooting outside and in daylight situations, or where you've been able to light things properly, the standard picture profile does an absolutely amazing job. And if you want to save yourself a lot of time in post, you know, shooting in log is not always the best thing to do, because it depends on your workflow, and you know, it depends what kind of project you're working on. But if it's a fast turnaround thing and you know that you're going to be able to light things, or you're going to be outdoors, you can definitely see the benefits of having shot something in the standard picture profile here. The log has a lot of benefits which we can look at in a second. Okay, now, so bad news, you've got to look at my face for a little while we test some exposures on the skin, and also I'm really putting the camera through its paces here on highlights and lowlights to the dynamic range of the camera. Cinema 5D has some pretty comprehensive dynamic range tests, and I'll leave a link in the description so you can see what their conclusions are. But just looking at the image here, you can see in the standard picture profile, the camera is exposed correctly according to what the camera estimates. But as you can see, there's quite a lot of clipping on the highlights on my shoulder, and then when I'm looking over to the side, you can see the same on my forehead. So this isn't all that successful in a situation like this where we do need a lot of dynamic range. And we can see the same sort of results in the natural picture profile setting. I think that the highlights look like they're not clipping quite as much on the standard, but that could be a fluctuation in the sunlight coming through the window, but similar kind of results. The flat picture profile maybe on first glance looks a bit better, but actually when we look a bit closer, it's still lost those highlights in the corner of the frame. You can see that there's just no information there in my shoulder, so it hasn't been able to keep all the highlights from the dark areas of the image to the brighter areas. Portrait mode again is very similar to natural, so we're losing all the information in the shoulder. Everything else is still there, but it's not able to handle those highlights. It's the same picture with Cine D. There's no information in my shoulder, completely overexposed, and interestingly the colour has shifted quite a lot here, so we've kind of got a much warmer tone. I think if we look at some of the other ones, it was a slightly more magenta-y shift, and here it's definitely a warmer look to the image. And the same can be said for Cine V, although obviously this looks really terrible, to be honest. It's really over contrasted. I can't see a situation in which I'd want to use this. The highlights are really overexposed on my shoulder, and to be honest, even the shadows look a lot worse than on standard. If you look at my left eye, there's just no information there at all. The 709L picture profile doesn't really seem to render the skin tones all that nicely, I don't think. I'm kind of looking a little bit more jaundiced than before, and we've got the same problems, to be honest, with the dynamic range of the camera. It's definitely overexposed on my shoulder. We'll have a look in a second, see if there's anything we can pull back there. But more interesting is the log profile on this, because this hopefully is where we're able to see that there's a lot more information kept. You're really starting to see the benefits of having a paid log upgrade, and the fact that this is a full V-log as opposed to the V-log Lite that you find on the GH5 and the GH4. When we put the LUT correction on here, it does have a magenta shift, which there always seems to be a bit of a magenta shift I find with the Panasonic LUT. But if you have a look over at my shoulder, there's definitely a lot more information there in the left shoulder than there has been in any of the other profiles, and the shadows don't even look as deep as before, so we've kind of got the choice there to be able to pull that either way. And finally, the HLG, again the colour has shifted really drastically here, although like with the log, the information is all there, so we're able to still use this, I'd say, and maybe in the grade in a second we'll have a look and see what we can pull out of this. So here, looking at all the images side by side, like we said before, the standard is definitely overexposed on the shoulder, and the same goes as well for all of them really, but I think in terms of the nicest looking image, probably we're looking at the natural picture profile there, because it's a little bit less contrasty, a bit softer. Even though it's overexposed, it might be usable in an edit if we needed to do that, if we were left with no other choice, but I wouldn't say any of these other profiles are really able to handle this kind of lighting condition at all. And moving on to the second set, it's the last three that are more interesting to look at really, because if we look at the log and then the log correction, obviously there's plenty of information in the shoulder, and the same goes for the hybrid log gamma, although now with those two side by side, you can see a huge difference in the skin tones that both of these are showing us here. So I would say neither of them are quite right. Definitely quite jaundice on the hybrid log gamma, but far too magenta on the V-Log. So that's something that obviously you could play about with in post. But now let's have a little look at trying to get these images to look as similar to each other as possible, and then we can decide what looks most usable. Keeping the standard as it is then, just in terms of trying to match the others to it, let's have a look at the next one along. This is the neutral. If we just take a look at the scopes, it's clearly in the shadows where we need to make a bit of a difference, because if we pull this down and then pull in the highlights up to try and match that as well. Now the flat one obviously looks completely different. To our eyes, this is really not looking great now. The image has broken up a lot more than it did in standard, even though standard we've just lost some information on the shoulder here. Skin tones have really gone out the window now that we've messed around with this quite a bit, and we can try and correct for that, but flat is not a great picture profile to use, and even though it looks kind of like it's got a bit of a log style to it, clearly it doesn't maintain the same characteristics because there's just not the information to pull back. Next we've got the portrait, which as we said before does look quite similar to standard. It's just down a little bit in the shadows, and the same up in the highlights, just a touch. I do think that the Cine D profile has more log style qualities to it. So now they're all looking quite a bit more similar to each other than they were originally, just jumping back to how they looked before. But yeah, they're looking quite similar. And so now looking at our next picture profiles, keeping standard there on the far left just for reference, and then we've got the Cine-like V, so this is the one that we said is a bit more contrasty, and actually you can see that in the scopes, this is even more contrasty than standard, so I don't know how much we're going to be able to pull this back, but if we just pull the shadows up a touch, and then trying to get the highlights up to match what we have in standard, using this point here, which is most likely my forehead that's clipped. There's some similarity, but again we've kind of got a bit of a warmer shift in tone here, so if we maybe just cool that off a little bit. And then we've got, next we've got the 709L. Doesn't look that great here, I don't think. You sort of lose the nice colour and warmth and saturation of standard, and don't really gain anything in terms of any kind of extra dynamic range, so I'm not sure how useful this profile is, but let's just try and get that a little bit closer. It's actually looking quite a lot muddier in terms of colour. I think we might just leave that because this just really doesn't look great, and I don't think that's very useful. Jumping back here, this obviously is our log image, so if we just drop that off just for a sec, you can see that's the straight out of camera, and I've just dropped the V-Log LUT onto there, which is the Panasonic LUT, which does always have a bit of a magenta tone to it. You can see that straight away. So rather than trying to match, let's just make sure we can use this image a bit more, because the shoulder has a lot more information there. You can see how much better the dynamic range is when you're shooting in log, but I'm not sure the image looks quite right just yet. So if we just take down the shadows, that looks a bit nicer. Highlights sitting somewhere around there, so you can see the highlights of my forehead there hitting much lower than on the standard picture profile, but that's because we've kept it in, so we're able to still see the dark side of the face and the light side of the face, and we're not clipping at either ends of the highlights or the shadows. And then finally the hybrid log gamma profile. Skin tone is all over the place on this one, so let's try and get him looking a bit closer, but he looks very jaundiced at the minute. So it's very interesting just that the colour straight out of the camera is completely different with the hybrid log gamma here than it is with any of the other picture profiles. You know, it's maybe a bit of a look that you want to go for, but you can see it's much more yellow skin tones than in all of the other ones, including even the V-Log. And so final thoughts here, looking at everything side by side. I am absolutely no colorist, and there's plenty of YouTube videos you can go and check out to see people who do a much better job than I do at color correction, but just as a quick check here to sort of look at things side by side, you can see here sort of I don't think any of the out of camera picture profiles are working all that well in the first batch here with such a contrasty image as this. Coming onto the second page, you can definitely see the benefits of log in a situation like this, and actually let's just jump over to having a look at the standard versus the log here. So just to sum up, in contrast with what I was saying earlier about outdoor scenes and the benefits of using standard there, here you really can see the importance of shooting in V-Log when you're in situations where maybe you have less control over the light, or where you're going to need to work a bit more in the edit with the image. The Vlog upgrade, I know it's expensive, it was £200 when I bought it, but I think for professional work this is really important because the standard picture profile just isn't cutting it here, and none of them are really, to be honest, except the Vlog was the only one that properly was able to keep the information there. The hybrid log gamma did keep the information as well, but I think the colour that's coming out of the camera with that profile is looking really strange to me, so it would be a lot more work in post-production to try and get something a bit more normalised with that. So I'm seeing the benefits of the Vlog here, definitely. So that's the test, and you can really see the benefit of using Vlog when you're working in challenging lighting environments where you have a little bit less control. However, in a situation like this where we've just got a simple studio lighting setup that we're in control of, it would be interesting to see whether the Vlog's really necessary. So now, as you can see, this is in Vlog, and then I can just go into the app. I'm using my phone here to record. I can change my picture profile over to standard, and so now this is what the image looks like when we're shooting in standard. So here we're just comparing everything side by side as we have done before, and I think now we're seeing a bigger difference between standard and portrait than we had done previously. Whereas portrait now does look to be blowing out a little bit on the highlights on the side of my face, I think standard is just keeping it within the range, and it looks really nice actually. It's quite contrasty, but it might work quite well in a situation like this where you've got some funky lighting in a studio environment. I think actually it's looking really nice, and the roll off across my face of the light is really, really good. And the natural looks quite nice too if you just want to soften those edges a little bit. The Cine D is looking okay, but there's a little bit of a strange tinge to the highlighted side of my skin tones, which I'm not so sure about. But I'm sure if you played about with that a bit, you could work out something that looked much nicer. Jumping to the second page, the Cine V I think is looking far too contrasty as we found before. The 709 lot is looking not so great on the skin tones. I think the colour of my skin there is not looking so great. So again, it's something you could work with in post-production, but if you're gonna give someone some footage to grade, it might as well be that log image, because as you can see here, the information you can pull out of the log is really nice. It doesn't look as magenta as it has done in the past, maybe a little bit too much, but I'm going to leave it for now because I think it works with the lighting in the scene. And the hybrid log gamma obviously is much darker as we found in the past, and the skin tone's not so nice, but I'm sure there's information that can be pulled out if you're doing HDR editing. Just to look at the two side-by-side standard and Vlog as we've done in the past, I think actually the standard is holding up really well here, and the skin tones look really nice. As I said, I think the Vlog is a little bit too magenta. If you like that high contrast look, I think the standard's working really well. If you're on a fast turnaround project and you just need to be able to deliver something really quickly, the standard does work when you're in control of the lighting. Obviously, if you're on projects where you've got a bit more time and you want to have a bit more creativity and control, the Vlog is always going to be better, but it just depends on your workflow and your style as well, what you prefer the look of and how you like to shoot. So I hope you found that useful. If you liked it, leave us a comment below, we'd love to hear from you. And if there's anything else you'd like to see in future videos, just leave us a comment or send us an email. Look forward to seeing you next time.